If anybody goes through the IPCC report, which is headed by an Indian who received the Nobel Prize finally, it's got tons and tons of data on how the atmosphere levels have gone up. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, the CO2 levels have gone up, methane has gone up, CFCs were non-existent earlier, and now it's gone up to 314 parts per billion. But it's not just the IPCC. NASA in 2007 said, since the mid-70s, there's been a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in the surface temperature of the Earth, and it's rising by 0.32 degrees every decade. We have something on the Arctic as well. The ice cover the summer ice cover is declined by 10%, and this is the Snow and Ice Data Center saying. We have the GISS saying that 8 of the warmest years since 1998 have been in history have been since 1998, and 14 warmest years have been since 1990, which means that from 1990 till date, in the past 18 years, the 14 warmest years have been now. A lot of people also think that, climate change is all about the Arctic and the polar ice and glaciers, and that why should we worry about it? If you look at 2007, the disasters that occurred in 2007 which were attributed to climate change, South Asia figures twice. One is the immense monsoon which caused flooding and affected 25 million people in India, and one is Bangladesh. And what happened in Bangladesh was, it witnessed the coldest January in 40 years. So let's not say that climate change is only affecting the North Pole and we've got nothing to do with it. If we talk of the impact of climate change throughout the world, if we see the sea level rise, as I mentioned, there's been a 17 centimeter rise in the previous century. But if there is a 1 meter rise in seawater levels, and there's a study by Nicole Leatherman which says that 18.6 million people in China, 13 million in Bangladesh, 7.1 million in India, 3.3 million people in Indonesia will be affected. I'm a journalist, and as we say, there's a story in that data. And what is the story? I said that the polar and the Arctic circle, it's not that climate change is taking place there. We say that ice is melting in the polar ice cap and the North Pole is suffering, but look at the human tragedy. The human tragedy is taking place in South Asia. If there is a 40 centimeter rise in sea levels, 55 million people in South Asia, 21 in Southeast Asia, 14 million in Africa, and only 3 million in the rest of the world will be affected. What does that mean? That while the polar ice caps are melting in the north, the human tragedy is there in the tropical countries. It's in South Asia. The rest of the world, only 3 million people are going to be affected. It's South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa which will suffer the most. So global warming may have been caused by CFCs or CO2 emitted by the developed nations. It may be occurring at the North Pole, but we are the ones who's going to suffer. It's not just about South Asia. Let's talk of India. The ADB, the Asia Development Bank, says that 7 million people in India will be affected by a 1 meter rise in water level. And 1/3 of Bangladesh will be submerged. This previous century, India suffered a huge catastrophe, which is partition. It's been called the greatest mass migration in history. And my generation was very fortunate, and we thought the word refugee would not occur in our dictionary or our lexicon. That refugees only occurred during partition, and that my generation would never see refugees. Sorry, this century we might see environmental refugees. If 1/3 of Bangladesh is submerged, and if in Orissa and West Bengal 1,700 square kilometers of land is submerged, and overall India 5,700 kilometers of land is submerged, then we will have environmental refugees. But let us say this tragedy had occurred in the 15th century in Bangladesh. People would have simply migrated north or west. People living in Dhaka could have crossed over and gone to Calcutta. We have the nation state today. I'm not trying to destroy the basis of a nation state, but today we have borders, and we have very strong borders, and when we have such a quantum of refugees, I wonder whether nation states will actually allow others to enter their country. In the previous century, this might have been possible, but the tragedy of environmental refugees is going to be much more serious than we initially thought. It's not just about Bangladesh. In India, the sea level rise will affect Goa very badly. 7% of the population in Goa will be affected. About 8 to 10,000 crores of worth of loss would take place. But apart from the sea level rise, how is it being caused? It's very simple. When the glaciers in the polar ice cap is melting, the excess amount of water is going to the sea. But secondly, and fairly significant, is that as global warming takes place, we know a principle of physics that water expands on heating. So as warming takes place, the sea level water is also expanding. And it is not just going to affect dispossessed people in coastal areas, the salinity of that water may actually affect the agriculture in the entire belt as well. Even the aquifers could be lost. The unfortunate part about Asia is that 60% of the world's population lives here, but Asia only has 36% of the renewable water resources. The majority of the renewable water resources lie in the northern hemisphere. And while the Himalayan glaciers feed such a huge population, they are the ones which are receding the most. Climatologists often complain in India and China that they don't share the snowfall data and the glaciers with each other. But the UNEP has said that the China glaciers are receding by 5.5% over the past few decades. And by 2050, 2/3 of the glaciers in China would be gone, and by 2100, there would be no glaciers. And if there are no glaciers and they don't melt, how will Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, actually get water? It's not just China. ICMOD, which is an institute in Kathmandu, did a survey of the Indian glaciers on the Chenab Basin, the Bada Shigri Glacier and the Chota Shigri Glacier. Last year, the glaciers were receding by 6.8 to 29.8 meters every year. Now what happens is that when glaciers start melting, the water comes and starts collecting in troughs. And they form new lakes which are known as glacial lakes. Now this has been a phenomenon very often. But now, since 1970s, these glacial lakes have increased by 800%. And there is a limit to the amount of water that this trough can carry, and suddenly there is a flash flood, which are called the glacial lake outburst floods, the GLOFs. And this is causing disaster in Nepal. Not only is that water lost, the road network and the power stations and everything gets kind of submerged in these glacial lake outbursts. We move on to the Satluj River Basin because that is closer home in Punjab. There's a study done by Institute of Hydrology, Roorkee, and a gentleman from Sweden, and it says, and I quote, in the Satluj River Basin, there will be a reduction of water availability during this summer period. Now, if Satluj will not have water during the summer, or if there's a reduction, summer is the time when we need water the most. We need it for our paddy, and the even power and the peak load considerations are the maximum. Climatologists often say that with global warming, we may have an increase in the monsoons in India. If the temperature goes up by about 3 to 5%, then there could be a 20% increase in monsoons. But there's no reason for us to be happy, because in 2006 came out another research which said there are 3 states in India which will not witness an increase in monsoonal rains. They will actually see a decline. And which are these states? Punjab, Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu. So actually, despite that increase in monsoon, which may actually cause greater flash floods, Punjab may witness a decline even in the monsoon rains, coupled with a decline in river waters in the Satluj Basin.